Howdy, all you delicious people with an extra side of delicious today. Anyways, we are here to go into this and otherwise realize that this episode was actually good. It was actually good because it actually went somewhere. And the ways of which that it had went, I was actually intrigued by for once. And plus also, we had a man who had came back from a place called Nantucket. I don't know if he said F it or not, but who knows. So, we have a man come back into the fray of this show, and ultimately I was like, oh, okay, well, this is probably going to be the best part of this episode. Surefire enough, yes, it was. We ultimately have to have a montage of scenes that ultimately I did hate, because it just kind of felt like, man, they just kind of, like, they have all this stuff going on, but then there's also these montaging, like, scenes mixed together that ultimately are just showcasing the life of which two people had led. And I kind of got annoyed with that, but ultimately I just had to give this episode really and truly just a break, because when really looking at it, at least we got somewhere in this episode. We had to be reminded that there was a war going on. Wow, there's a war going on? Because who would have known? Because ultimately, the last 3 episodes just told us that Shadow Moon has nothing but time to go and look for a lost girl, and so on and so forth. Reasonably, within this episode, we had it to where Shadow Moon is not looking for a girl. He is ultimately getting going and finding a girl and figuring out what the heck happened with her. Because ultimately we have it to where seemingly there's a team up going on between Shadow Moon and Technical Boy to ultimately track down Bilquist. So also within this episode we have it to where Odin has his bizarrish story that makes no rational sense. And reasonably, we are also going to talk about Laura in this episode, which is actually great. But reasonably, when we talk about Laura more in this episode, reasonably, there is a thing that is kind of also eating away at the back of my mind as well. To ultimately go like, okay, well, Laura came back and Laura came back as Laura. But what was to happen to the other end of that spectrum of, there were 2 bodies in that graveyard, in that grave place, that grave plate, whatever she was at. What happened to the other person? What happened to the? What happened? Why couldn't they have done what they did? If you know, I don't know. Reasonably, there's some stuff about this show that doesn't make any rational sense in all actuality of like what happens to Laura in this episode. But we just have to keep going with it, follow the bouncing ball, and ultimately hope that all will go well at some point. So, going into this episode, I thought that this episode was just better than any of the... It was better just because it did something. All it needed to do was just do better than what it had been doing, and it won me over easily. And then plus it incorporated people that I'm like, yeah, I've missed these people. I really have. And ultimately, I was just waiting for the shoe to fall on the right foot, if you know what I mean, to ultimately have us go back into something that either was weird and or bizarre, or just by and large something that won me over. We ultimately have Odin, who is really kind of actually really funny in this episode, and I actually like the stuff that he was doing in this episode. So ultimately, I think that this episode, if you guys have lost interest, really I can understand. But I think we have kind of gotten back into hopefully either relevant show or they're realizing that we need to do something within the show now, and because ultimately we're going to start losing viewers if we don't. So I'm wondering if in the next episodes we're going to get some either clunky episodes, or recently we're going to be able to get back into the swing of momentum and have more vitally important episodes than what we have been having. I'll have what she's having. So let's ultimately go into spoilers about these episodes. If anything, I don't know. There's something about this episode that I just thought was like good. So if anything, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode. So recently, I did ultimately see Shadow Moon is with Technical Boy. If anything, we had a opening scene where we seemingly had some people in a flashback scene ultimately picking cotton to ultimately kind of showcase the time period where there were seemingly people that were picking cotton ultimately to have their feet chained and stuff like that. And they ultimately were to get rescued, and I'm like, good for them. All right. And ultimately, I was kind of really just kind of like, okay. Again, I don't quite understand what exactly that scene had anything to do with the overall episode of anything. But that was, I guess, just an interesting scene that we saw at once. Okay. So, anyways, pushing on. So we went on to here, and we have to our technical boy is with Shadow Moon, and we have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately asking Technical Boy, "Hey man, what happened?" We'll ultimately have it to where Technical Boy is having a phone of sorts that ultimately is to seemingly, I believe, being connected with so many several people. At some point, you would think it's either Bilquist's phone, or ultimately you would think it would be Bill Sanders' phone, or otherwise you would think it's just a number of other people. Because ultimately we have it to where Technical Boy is technically telling what had gone down with Bilquist ending up killing two men, and we ultimately have it to where Technical Boy is having some technical difficulties. We are seeing him consistently uh, like he's like falling into pieces, or he's ultimately kind of like being very in and out. To ultimately we consistently see him like kind of falling to pieces a little bit here and there. And we have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately asking him like, what the heck is going on? And Technical Boy had said that it's like, well, this is what Bilquist did to me. She effed me up. I'm like, okay, I remember actually seeing Technical Boy in the fray of Bilquist beating down two men, but okay, sure. So we eventually have it to where reasonably Shadow Moon is looking for Bilquist and is trying to track her down, and ultimately we are having it to where Technical Boy is having to go with Shadow Moon because ultimately Technical Boy needs to help, or needs help to be fixed by Bilquist. So we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon and Technical Boy team up, and ultimately they are on a road trip to make their way to Bilquist to ultimately find a suit and tied man where ultimately they can get information from, and ultimately we have it to where Technical Boy shows himself to seemingly one of these suit guys with the thing in his ear, and ultimately tells that Technical Boy is some alien of sorts. So we ultimately have it to where this suited guy is spilling the beans to ultimately head have these guys head to where Bilquist is. And so while that is going on, we ultimately have Odin going into this biker bar, ultimately to see a man called Johan, who ultimately seems to not quite understand the rules. It seems that there is some backstory about a man that is going and defying the odds. Ultimately, because it's a being of Wednesday, and and Wednesday can defy the rules. So so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Johan is sitting down with Odin because Johan is starting to kill some of his own men in his bar because ultimately his band members had been killed. So we ultimately have Odin sitting down with Johan, and it seems like Johan is slowly but surely losing control, killing everyone at the bar. But ultimately, we have it to where Odin is speaking to Johan, and Johan is ultimately grieving the loss of his band members, and ultimately we have it to where even Johan is suspected of killing his own band members, and Johan is like, dude, I didn't kill my own band members. So we have it to where eventually Odin is ultimately telling Johan, it's like, well, I think it's about time for you to just sleep it off. It's like, if anything, just like, like get your together and ultimately like stop killing all the people that are in this bar because they're actually our followers. We ultimately have it to where Johan is to leave this said bar, and eventually we find out that the bar had exploded. The bar had exploded, and ultimately we have it to where Odin is coming from out of this bar, ultimately stripping all of his clothes off with the exclusion of a coat, and he is speaking nonsense. We have Odin's fiance that had ultimately given him a burner phone shortly here before this, and we have it to where Odin called a 21-digit number to ultimately contact Technical Boy to talk to Shadow Moon. And ultimately, we have it to where Odin needed Shadow Moon for a job, and ultimately Shadow Moon was busy trying to get to Bilquist. So we have it to where ultimately now Odin is spouting nonsense to where ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon or Shadow Moon. Odin is spouting nonsense, and ultimately he is basically, again, the only thing that he has left on him now is just his coat, and he is ultimately just kind of walking around into the middle of the street where ultimately cars are honking and say, hey, nice schwanz, and everything like that. And everybody's like talking about him, like, yeah, you crazy loon. We ultimately have it to where Odin's fiance is scrambling to get Odin and eventually gets him into an ambulance. And we have it to where eventually, while Shadow Moon is on his way to get to Bilquist, he ultimately is to have a phone ring in a phone booth. And we have it to where it's Odin's fiance calling Shadow Moon to ultimately saying that, like, well, yeah, your father had gotten into a bar explosion, and ultimately he's he's to be okay, but he's spouting all crazy nonsense. To ultimately we have it to where Odin like blubbers that a monkey had crapped in his shorts or something like that. And I thought that it was like absurd, like all the stuff that he was saying. But anyways, we have it to where ultimately Odin's fiance is ultimately telling Shadow Moon that he's kind of crazy as a loon. And we have it to where Shadow Moon is just saying, like, well, just give him a straitjacket or whatever. Like, send him to a mental hospital or something to kind of, like, work him out of this. I don't know what to do. So we have it to where ultimately we have Bilquist, who is ultimately with the new gods. We ultimately have it to where Miss God ultimately changes into being Mr. or what did I say? We ultimately have Miss World ultimately change to be Mr. World, and we have it to where ultimately Crispin Glover ultimately goes and takes his hat and puts it on, and ultimately says like I'm handsome kind of thing, and ultimately he goes to talk to Bilquist, ultimately to mention that Bilquist is going to have to stay under the thumb of Mr. World or Mrs. World because Bilquist had killed Bill Sander, and if ultimately Bilquist was to be able to magically have Bill Sader appear, then ultimately Bilquist would be gone. But considering Bill Sander is completely dead now because what Bilquist had done, reasonably we have it to where Mr. World is keeping her for as long as humanly possible, ultimately telling her that if she were to choose the side of the new gods, ultimately all the other gods would be able to were ultimately to come to her side as well, and that ultimately every person that ultimately Odin had the side be like ultimately we have it to where Mr. World is ultimately just trying to collect every single god, whether it's old or new or whatever, to basically just outgun Odin. Basically to the point of saying, well, if Bilquist chooses this side, it seems that Bilquist could probably turn a lot of other people, a lot of other old gods, to Mr. World's side as well, and we'll end up having just Odin just having no army. Like basically, it's a numbers game right now to basically just go like, well, if Mr. World just has more people on his side than Odin, then ultimately Mr. God will win. And so reasonably that's what Mr. World's game now is to ultimately just have it be that ultimately if Mr. World can persuade all the old gods to come to his side, then there is no war. Which I think is kind of interesting. So we ultimately have it to where Bilquist is still not choosing a side, so Mr. World just kind of walks off because reasonably Bilquist is what she is. So we have it to where Bilquist is seemingly getting tortured with loud music, but eventually we have it to where ultimately Bilquist is to talk to some woman that ultimately is called Ocean. We ultimately have it to where seemingly this god is something that I think I would have been reminded of from Shadow Moon's dream, but maybe I was wrong about that. And so we ultimately have it to where it seems that Bilquist is ultimately dancing around bizarrely with this girl, and we have it to where there's cards that is ultimately seeing Bilquist dance around in this music with this hardcore metal music that makes no sense to dance to like that. And ultimately the guards are saying like, did we break her? Like, is she crazy now? Like, so pushing on. So now we have to get to the journey of Laura. So ultimately the last time we had left Laura, ultimately Laura had taken the coin from out of her bate, and ultimately she had went to a movie theater that is The Life of Laura, and ultimately we have it to where Laura is ultimately just mentioning how pointless it was for her to go through The Life of Laura into the movie theater and go. And so we have it to where ultimately Laura is seemingly in purgatory, I would assume. And so Laura's ultimately going and just kind of like waiting for her turn, waiting for her time, just kind of waiting around, ultimately talking to some people about what she had done, what had her life led her to, because ultimately there's just people just waiting around, so ultimately they're just talking to one another. And we eventually seem to have it to where Laura ends up getting from purgatory back to where she was. She ends up going and is now uh, sitting right back where she was. It seems that there had been people, there had been some caretaker of sorts that went into seeing the leprechaun and ultimately Laura's body all in shambles and stuff like that. And ultimately, we have this caretaker that had taken the leprechaun body, and now we are to figure out what had happened with that. So we end up having Laura come back from the dead, basically with absolutely no clothes on, and we ultimately have to where the caretaker ends up finding Laura, and we end up having it to where Laura is noticing that the coin is off to the side, and Laura is like, oh my god, I am alive. How is it that I'm alive? This makes no sense. And again, I'm also thinking, like, what is going on here? This really does make no sense. So we have it to where Laura is ultimately now a real boy, so to speak, in Pinocchio terms, and we have it to where bizarrely Laura is eating and drinking like a normal human being, and it seems that Laura is ultimately uh, a real boy. So I was like, okay, but where is the leprechaun? So we find out that the leprechaun had ultimately gotten incinerated or uh, had been burnt. His body had been burnt and cremated. And so we ultimately have it to where Laura is ultimately going, oh crap. So he's really like gone forever and there's nothing that I can do. And so we have it to where Laura ultimately is to reminisce consistently about the time that her and the leprechaun had together. And I'm like, no! I actually liked Mad Sweeney, and I'm kind of ticked off that ultimately I'm like, so the leprechaun is now dead? Is he dead for good now? What kind of garbage is this? Like, if the leprechaun is absolutely done, or they're gonna bring somebody else to be the leprechaun, I hope to God that they don't. Because I freaking don't want anybody else to play the leprechaun. I think that'll be garbage if that happens. There should be a way to figure out how to resurrect this character. If the character is completely 100% gone and there's no bringing him back, I am going to be upset because man, have I really enjoyed the Leprechaun. Like I was assuming that like the next time we were going to see the whole Leprechaun thing, or Laura and the Leprechaun story, Mad Sweeney's story, I was thinking that they were going to bring them both back. But instead, it's like, oh no, they're just dead now. Laura's okay, but Leprechaun is completely 100% donezo. And I'm like, you, show? No, I actually like the Leprechaun. I actually like the interaction between these two characters and the journey of which that they were going. But now we're just gonna have Laura all on her own, and who is she gonna team with? Salim? Who is she gonna team up with now? And then plus two, really we have it to our Odin and Shadow Moon and also Salim are still on the run, supposedly. How is it that none of these people have yet to be, one, arrested yet, and two, whatever happened to Salim? Is he just gone now? What happened to the Jinn? Is he dead? What is going on with any of these people? Good God, solve some questions for me, peoples. Solve some questions. So, we ultimately have to where Laura is eating and having some good times with eating her food. And we ultimately have to where the caretaker ends up giving her the box of the leprechaun's ashes. And ultimately, the caretaker had mentioned to Laura, it's like, well, this isn't exactly the way of which that we go about doing things, but meh, whatever. Like, here you go. So we ultimately have it to where Laura is to get the leprechaun's ashes, and so ultimately the caretaker is saying like, you know what, like, I wouldn't normally be saying this, but it seems that like you have brought back faith to me. Like that ultimately a dead person could be revived and otherwise this and that. So we have it to where Laura is ultimately going, and she is going on some hitchhiking ride with some person that can't speak English. I think he ultimately was speaking Spanish. And so ultimately, we just have Laura going off, seemingly going and thumbing it from person to person to person, trying to find her way to get to her next location, her next journey. And I think that's where ultimately we can kind of just leave it off within this episode. Again, I there was so many interesting things that I liked about here. It took us a while to resolve some people's journeys, especially whatever happened to Laura. I was like, okay, I want to get back to that, and then like, when are they gonna get back to that? And then finally, it was like, okay, finally we got some resolution to this, of like what had happened or whatever, and then ultimately Odin going bat crap crazy like is ultimately interesting because I'm like, okay, maybe this will lead to interesting episodes for ultimately to be or to have Odin being really weird or absurd or saying nonsensical things. And um like Shadow Mode and team and Technical Boy teaming up together I thought was really interesting. We have it to where ultimately we had Technical Boy having to kind of again try to apologize for the lynching that he had done to Shadow Moon, and we have to where Shadow Moon is still never going to forgive him for that. And we have it to where Shadow Moon is to like walk off and just be like, God, I'm never going to ever reasonably like treat Technical Boy like a good person. Like I thought it was really interesting that Shadow Moon was just kind of tossing Technical Boy around. It was really cool. I liked that scene where he was just kind of chucking Technical Boy all over the room. And I thought that that was really interesting. So we ultimately found out when I think Technical Boy was talking to Shadow Moon that ultimately it seems that Bill Sater's daughter was talking and was consistently calling Bill Sater, and it seems like every single message they were getting more and more panicked about where Bill Sater was. So ultimately, like I'm assuming we're going to get into more of quite possibly like what is to happen with Bill Sater's character, even though reasonably he was just kind of like a real, like I thought this was going to be like a forgetful thing, but I kind of liked how it seems like there was an after effect to this character being gone, and ultimately they never really did that before, because every other person I guess that Bill Quist ended up consuming was just a throwaway, but I guess Bill Sater, it's like, oh well, he's a different story. We have to go into having a aftermath kind of situation about him, but who cares about anybody else that ultimately Bilquist had consumed at some point. I thought that that was really interesting. But other than that, I think that's all I want to say about this episode. I think when really looking at it, uh, I could be much more optimistic about this one. Going in further to just say, like, okay, well, maybe we're going to have filler episodes for at least the next 3 episodes, probably. It's probably going to go back to being filler. So I think it's probably one of those where it's like, well, we have to give people something in specific episodes, but then anything after that, it could just be like the arduous process to just fill time in between. And so I'm like, man, that's gonna kind of sucks. So there's only going to be probably maybe out of 8 episodes, there's probably going to be maybe 3 really valuable ones, which is probably going to be the starting of the season, the middle of the season, and then the very last episode. And then I'm wondering if ultimately people are going to keep going and being interested in the show afterwards, after realizing the formula of them kind of just what is it called? They're kind of shuffling their feet until ultimately they're going to get on the dance floor, so to speak. Like, give us a real, true, interesting um, kind of showcasing. And so we'll see if there's going to be a season 4. I'm kind of hesitant on really, especially with this season, if there's going to be a season 4. With looking how eventually we're kind of just like there's a lot of delay going on. Even in this episode, I felt like there was some interesting things going on, but then again, I was like, man, they are just really trying to delay as heavily and humanly possible to just kind of like not exactly seem to go anywhere with anything, but I just thought that what they were putting on was a fascinating thing within this episode compared to the other episodes that were just like, man, were they hard to watch. So, if anything, I am ultimately going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.